Today we're going to be looking at Deleuze and as well Guattari's Rhizomatic Linguistics. This is basically a summary of the first, second, and fourth chapter or plateaus of Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus. We'll be starting by outlining some of the history of Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari and the project that they're aimed at. Then we'll move into the idea of their critique of representationalism and the rhizome. And we'll talk about how this affects the notion of deviation and their emphases on creation. We will then use these to discuss their critique of Freud's structuralist psychology, as well as Noam Chomsky's structuralist linguistics. And then we will look at a specific instance of African American vernacular English and how this connects to their notion of becoming minoritarian. So Deleuze and Guattari are postmodern philosophers, and they're very infamous for being very strange. And they're focusing particularly on the creation and implementation of concepts as such. This is what they see philosophy as being uniquely suited to do. And many of the things that they're trying to get out from under is the notion that concepts and existence are self-sufficient. Instead, they want to focus on concepts and anything as being necessarily involved in a social field, which they will call an assemblage. They're influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche, D.H. Lawrence, and Antonin Artaud, and these are very similar to other postmodern philosophers' influences such as Foucault or Baudrillard. And an important implication of their philosophy that you'll get throughout reading Anti-Oedipus, but also A Thousand Plateaus, is that philosophy is fundamentally political. That when we feel as if notions are not political, that is in fact probably when they are the most political. And this is epitomized by the fact that Deleuze and Guattari met around May 68, which was this big kind of ambiguous uprising. I've done a lecture here on this channel detailing an essay they did titled May 68 Did Not Take Place. And they kind of rallied around this, with Deleuze being kind of your traditional academic philosopher in the modern sense, and Deleuze being more of an experimental psychologist. He was also a political activist, and he founded this experimental clinic, La Borde. And together they build a theory called Skizzy Analysis as an alternative to psychoanalysis and the practices within it, which they saw as properly fascistic and governing the unconscious unnecessarily. And as such, they want to try to find a way to free desire from certain limitations which were placed upon it by Freud and, to a lesser extent, Lacan. The rhizome is a concept that Deleuze, and I'll just be saying Deleuze even though I know Guattari is involved as well, this is something that he develops to combat representationalism, which is epitomized in trees as seen here on the right, and philosophically is very prominent in, for example, Plato's idea of the forms. With the forms, you basically had ideas which are perfect and absolute and self-sufficient, and these represent the relationless and unmediated concept as such. So for example, purple. You have different things which are colored purple, where purple is an attribute, and then you have the form, which is purple as such. It's not related to anything, it is simply the pure form of purple. And the reason we can use the word like purple and all mean the same thing for Plato is because there exists an absolute form which we all, when we use the word purple to refer to different objects, there are certain commonalities among these different variants or particulars of purple that can be aggregated to the form of purple. And this is epitomized with the tree. And the tree, or representationalism, they're going to call arborescence or arborescent thinking. And it basically sees existence or ontology as hierarchical. So you've got the foundation with the seed and kind of the point from which the tree springs forth. And as you get further and further out in the limbs, it gets weaker. And if we think about the way trees are used in different systems of taxonomy or all sorts of fields where trees are used to relate different things in a large system, we can think of languages, for example, where the Romance languages and Germanic languages and kind of Nordic languages, all of these are seen as coming from Proto-Indo-European, which is basically a originator language from which they all derived. And this is the problem, is that variation starts to become viewed as deviation or derivation. And representational thinking is marked by this notion of teleology, too, which is to say things have an inherent purpose which pre-exists the way they actually exist in the world. So, for example, the tree, from the moment it's a seed, it has the teleological function of eventually becoming, this full tree as we see in the picture. And because of this, it also has the quality of being definite. It has a starting point, the seed from which everything comes. And thus, the responses that the tree has are coded within it already. It is going to do a certain number of things that are going to make it a tree as such. And thus, it can be seen as pre-social. It has an existence before it interacts with things. The tree is going to necessarily have certain functions which it can carry out before it even enters a social relation with, for example, the air above the soil. And in representational thinking, variation starts to become seen as a lack. And this is epitomized with some of these misleading questions that Deleuze and Guattari point out, such as, where are you going? Where are you coming from? What are you heading for? As if these had some pre-existent definitions. In contrast to a tree, we have the rhizome. And there are a bunch of different rhizomes. And as you can see in the picture, it's this very heterogeneous mix of different roots and tubers and nodules and corpuscles. And it's a type of root, kind of, but it's very different from a root in some very key ways. It's non-teleological. So there is no pre-established purpose which the rhizome will engage in. Potatoes are rhizomes, is a good example. And they'll basically respond to their environment, and they will build potatoes as a way to store fuel and energy for the rest of the rhizomatic network. And that's an important component too, is that the rhizome is a network. And as such, it's non-hierarchical. It's just this heterogeneous lump where no part is necessarily more important than the others, but rather simply serves a function in a given situation. One of the most important qualities is that it is ambiguous. It has no starting point. You can't point to one part of the rhizome and say, this is where everything sprung forth. Because the rhizome exists as a network, as an essentially social organism. And thus, and this is something Deleuze and Guattari want to point out, is that nature, as epitomized by the rhizome, can be creative. It creatively reacts to its environment, such that variation is the rule. Instead of variation being a lack, variation becomes a creative tactic that the rhizome uses. Deleuze calls this coming and going rather than starting and finishing. So it's not so much as starting from a specific point and finishing at a specific point, like the tree, for example, but instead it merely meanders. In the last paragraph of the first plateau, Deleuze and Guattari say, a rhizome has no beginning or end. It is always in the middle, between things, intermezzo. The tree imposes the verb to be, but the fabric of the rhizome is the conjunction and. This conjunction carries enough force to shake and uproot the verb to be. So instead of looking at existence as a static to be, they instead want to look at a form of existence which is epitomized by the rhizome, which simply conjugates, it adds, and it expands, but in a creative way that doesn't follow a pre-made code. As we expand this analogy a little bit, it's important to ask, what exactly is a rhizomatic ontology? And we see here kind of a very interesting picture. Each plateau in 1,000 Plateaus starts with a picture or painting of some kind. And in this case, this is a very wacky piece of music, a very interesting listen, by the way. And we can see that it resembles the rhizome in many ways with its heterogeneous, non-hierarchical construction. And in terms of what the rhizome entails as a concept for ontology, is that there is no pre-existent form. The general form that the rhizome takes at any one point, and by extension this would apply to anything that exists, is equiprimordial with its particulars. And this is some very dense language. This is Heideggerian language for anyone who's unfamiliar. And equiprimordial basically means they are equally primordial. Neither one comes first, but rather they presuppose one another in mutual conjunction. The form that the rhizome takes at any one point is dependent upon the different flows that are acting upon it. Water, pH, air pressure, salinity. And all of these are going to interact with various different sections and on the entire organism to a greater or lesser extent, and thus allow for a form to come out, such as the potato that grows, which is dependent upon its environment. And it's not separatable from its environment. Yet it's also not the same as its environment. The potato and air pressure are obviously different things. So Deleuze and Guattari are trying to see how these are similar but not identical. And thus, form is instantiated in an assemblage, or a network, or a milieu. And this has the implication of this essentially social function, that everything is related in a social manner, just like people in a society are related in a social manner. An important part about the rhizome and assemblages as well, because these two concepts are getting at a very similar point, is that it's not reducible in both ways. It is not reducible to points. This is epitomized by their statement, there are no individual statements. That everything that we take as a point is actually contextualized in a large network, and thus is not reducible to those points. But it's also not reducible to pure relations. The rhizome is not just pure function or tendency with no matter. Because you have to have matter which is tending towards something, or functioning in some way, or relating to other things. We can't talk about existence without talking about things. Yet we also need to situate these things in a social network or an assemblage, which is going to contextualize how they came about and keep us from assuming that that form pre-exists the relations. This also entails that there is no lack in the absolute sense. Lack is defined with reference to some sort of pre-social representation. For example, the tree, and a tree that doesn't grow enough is seen as lacking. But only if we presuppose that a tree is bound by certain rules of its functioning which pre-exist its existence. Now, Deleuze and Guattari deny pre-social ontology, that we can talk about existence without talking about relations, and therefore they also deny lack. Instead, they want to talk about desiring production, which is to say that everything that is a process of desire, and we can use this to varying degrees of analogy. In the loosest possible sense, they mean desire in the sense of tendency. Like when I desire to drink water, I am pulled or called to some function, to enter into conjunction with some object as a result of neurotransmitters inside my body, environmental conditions which are accelerating my thirst. And thus, the notion of me being thirsty obviously doesn't make sense without talking about all these different social factors which are causing me to be thirsty. All the chemicals inside me, all the chemicals around me, what I have at hand. And when we basically broaden this analogy, everything desires in the loosest possible sense, in the sense that a book desires to drop to the ground when I let go of it, in the sense that it obeys some tendency, which, just like my thirst, is dictated by its social relations. What are the flows that, in this case, are pulling the book towards the ground? And of course, that would be gravity. Also, is there anything in the way of the book falling on the ground, such as a table? That is a social factor which changes the function and what the book is doing at any one time. Moving into a critique of Freud, Sigmund Freud is from, of course, 1856 to 1939, as I have here on this slide, and Freud had some really interesting contributions, but some of which Deleuze and Guattari are going to problematize rather scathily in the second plateau of their work, where Freud says that the mind consists of the conscious and the unconscious as structures. And this makes sense, right? You have things that you're consciously thinking about, and you have things that you have unconsciously that don't bubble up unless they pass a certain threshold of importance, or unless you're confronted with some reality that forces that out of you. But for Freud, he basically codes the unconscious. He representationalizes the unconscious. And he says that the unconscious is governed by the Oedipus complex and the castration complex. Now, Oedipus or Oedipus or Oedipus, there's so many different ways to pronounce this, is basically something he's going to epitomize in his dream analyses. And in the dream analyses, he's going to basically interpret in Oedipus. He's going to talk with the patient, or rather have the patient talk to him, and the patient is going to relay to Freud the real content of the dream, which is to say, the thing that was actually experienced. And it's Freud's job, as the psychoanalyst, to extract from the real content the latent content, which is what is actually being represented by the real content, but which can only express itself as real content because it is something unconscious which is being partially suppressed. And Freud famously does this in his whole corpus of dream analyses, but Deleuze and Guattari take issue with a particular instance, which is the wolf man. And this is basically a patient that Freud has who we can see an image of basically what the patient saw in his dream, where he's in his bed and there's a window at the end of his bed, and in the middle of the night in his dream, the window suddenly opens and there's these wolves sitting out there, and they're very still. There's no movement in the entire dream other than the window opening, and they are still and silent. And Freud basically reduces this dream content to when he was a young child, he saw his mom and dad fucking, and now he's got some kind of neuroses that result from this. And it's pretty crazy, you know, it's interesting to read, but the problem is that Freud ignores what is not reducible to Oedipus. He looks at the dream content and he looks for numbers, different archetypal themes, and he basically tries to take out of this dream, okay, well, what do these strange things mean? Like, for example, the wolves have sheep's tails, and the particular number of wolves, which I believe there were 7 wolves in the dream, but we only see 5 here, which is very telling, which is that, for example, if you have 4 wolves in your dream, he would say, well, that's a multiple of 2 and you have 2 parents or something like this. So he basically reduces the content and says, okay, there's these patterns which are indicative of the Oedipus and castration complexes being subconsciously suppressed. And when Freud goes into his dream analyses, any deviance from the Oedipus complex, anything that seems to contradict on the face of it the Oedipus complex, is either happenstance that's not important, or it is suppression of Oedipus that just confirms that because you want Dr. Freud to be wrong, this doesn't show Oedipus, which actually proves that Oedipus is there all along. So instead, Deleuze and Guattari want to come up with, instead of psychoanalysis, schizoanalysis. And I'm not going to go too much into the name because it hinges a lot on Anti-Oedipus, which is their first work in this 2-work series, of which we're looking at the second work. But they basically use the schizophrenic as a better model for looking at desiring production in the unconscious. And in schizoanalysis, which they use this term in many ways, sometimes they just use this as kind of a quote-unquote clinical term when they're looking at the conscious or unconscious mind, and sometimes they use this to talk about ontology as a whole, but usually they will use different terms when they're talking about ontology as a whole. But in schizoanalysis, everything, including the mind, is a result of desiring production. So desire produces based on the environment, and as a result, a structure, such as the unconscious, doesn't precede flows. It doesn't have some function coded into it in advance from the experiences that it experiences, which means not everyone is going to be Oedipal or Oedipal. Some people might have bad experiences with their parents that would essentially be Oedipal in nature, but plenty won't. And this is something that Deleuze and Guattari point out, is that not everything is Oedipus. The flows are what allow the unconscious to function in any way. And as a result, they don't want to overcode the unconscious with the Oedipus complex, but instead, they want to attentively create. They say in one of my favorite plateaus in the work, on the faciality plateau, they say, know your faces. It is the only way you will be able to dismantle them and draw your lines of flight, which is to say your creative paths. So deviation, for Deleuze and Guattari, all the stuff in the dream analyses that Freud wants to ignore, Deleuze and Guattari say, that's the really important stuff. For example, Freud thinks that he can just reduce wolves to parents, but wolves don't hunt in packs. You don't have 5 parents in this particular case with this illustration. There are very important stuff which it's rather arbitrary what Freud decides is significant in one dream and not in another. Sometimes the number of objects present will be really important for Freud and take center stage. Sometimes it's an afterthought, sometimes it's ignored altogether. And thus, the real content is what should be faced, and it should be situated in its relations that allowed it to come about, instead of trying to invent this latent content. And thus, one big idea in psychology and just culture in general that they want to dispel with is the notion of the true self. There is no true self, but rather the self that appears. And if you want some sort of self to come about, then you need to know your faces, like Deleuze and Guattari say. You need to know the sort of functions that have been coded as a result of your environment, the sort of faces you can take on, so to speak. And then you need to tarry with those in a very creative way. And then we will be able to start entertaining a post-structuralist idea of psychology. Now, two of the most important questions that Deleuze and Guattari are worried about is what makes one thing creative and another not? What makes working in an assembly line not creative or creative? Or what makes a rhizome creative or not creative? And as an extension of this sort of question, when applying this to linguistics in the 4th plateau of A Thousand Plateaus, they ask, well, when does language end and nonsense begin? What defines what a language is as opposed to gobbledygook? The next thinker on the chopping block is Noam Chomsky, who's a very famous structuralist linguist, also cognitive psychologist, really one of the founders of modern cognitive psychology. And Chomsky looks at all the different languages, and he makes some wonderful points, and he's a great social activist, by the way. Both I and Deleuze and Guattari disagree with him on language. Chomsky looks at kids who can learn a language just by listening to it without having to really be taught it. They just soak it up like a sponge. He says, well, how did they take all this information and turn it into this complex system that is language? And his solution is that there has to be some sort of apparatus inside every mind which allows for auditory stimuli to be taken in and be conjugated in certain specific ways such that language comes about. And for Chomsky, this is an innate universal grammar, or grammaticality is another way that Deleuze and Guattari prefer to use that word. Now, the universal grammar, or grammaticality, is the precondition that allows for any complex signifying, phonological, formal system like language to come about. And this basically allows Chomsky to come up with some sort of way of distinguishing between what is a language and what is not. And it basically comes down to, does it have this complex grammatical structure? And therefore, when we ask, how do we know what is a language? Chomsky says, reduce it to universal grammar. And this universal grammar is actually rather tricky. Different languages have completely different grammatical rules. But obviously, we all recognize that there are certain similarities in concepts like nouns and verbs and adjectives and subject-object agreement, or plural versus singular, or clauses or declarative statements. Like, we have these concepts we use in linguistics, and many languages share them. But of course, many languages have grammatical concepts that do not exist in another language. Or they have phonological concepts which exist but don't in others. For example, you could think about tones, which exists in Mandarin Chinese and in other dialects of Chinese or different versions of Chinese. And tones basically allow you to alter the meaning of the word. And in fact, the meaning of the word depends on the intonation used when audiating it. So when we look at all these different languages, it becomes very difficult to think about, okay, what is this universal grammar? I mean, sure, language A and language B might share some commonality, and language C and language B might have some commonality. But language A and C don't have certain commonalities. So we can kind of create a tree, but there's random spots that are completely distant or completely distinct from other grammatical uses or phonological uses of concepts. So this is where we have to point out that Chomsky was worried about experimentation. He admitted that this required actual experimentation on human subjects to figure out what is this universal grammar. And there's a wonderful interview between Noam Chomsky and Brian McGee, which is really helpful for getting at Chomsky's concepts. And it's a useful one to watch. And in that, Chomsky problematizes his own concept, and he says, look, this is extremely difficult to study for, and it has yet to be proven experimentally. And the critique that Deleuze and Guattari levy at Noam Chomsky is that it assumes an ideal language, viz. Grammaticality, that depends on essentially abstracting away from what languages actually are. It doesn't actually account for how language actually presents itself or how it actually functions, but rather, just like Freud, treats variations as sometimes just incidental, just not important. But Deleuze and Guattari actually want to see deviation as this norm, deviation as the most important thing that defines what a language is, not by what stays the same, but by what changes. So Chomsky is going to look for a pre-social structure or form that is the precondition for language. Deleuze and Guattari are going to say that first we have all this cacophonous auditory stimuli, and the different things that we utter are results of desiring production, which essentially is a tendency for something to function in some way, given social circumstances. And this yields language. So language is relational. And it's not pre-social, it's not ideal. It is real, it is in the moment, and it's constantly changing. And the change is actually the stuff that we should be focused on. Now, considering that form and structure is not the rule, and that instead creativity, or quote-unquote deviation, is, this means that form is ad hoc. It comes after the fact. So grammaticality, the form that essentially holds a language together, is imposed via what Deleuze and Guattari call order words. In terms of defining order words, they give us a quotation, which I don't have here on the slide. I didn't want to add another quotation here. But they say here on page 76, let people say, ... That is all language demands. Spengler notes that the fundamental forms of speech are not the statement of a judgment or the expression of a feeling, but the command, the expression of obedience, the assertion, the question, the affirmation or negation. Very short phrases that command life and are inseparable from enterprises and large-scale projects. Ready? Yes. Go ahead. Words are not tools, but we give children language, pens, and notebooks as we give workers shovels and pickaxes. A rule of grammar is a power marker before it is a syntactical marker. The order does not refer to prior significations or to a prior organization of distinctive units. Quite the opposite. Information is only the strict minimum necessary for the emission, transmission, and observation of orders as commands. One must be just informed enough not to confuse fire with for. So what comes first is not form, but rather a bunch of relations where things are fighting for power, for expression, and for making other things obedient. And it needs to use order in order to create form. So heterogeneity, multiplicity, variation, this is the default. And the goal of language is basically to define what people are allowed to, what they get let to say. And you need to use small order words like go ahead or ready or yes, which allow grammar to come about only as a way for order to be transmitted, to be observed, and to be respected. And they say language is not to be believed, but to be obeyed, and to compel obedience. Language is not life. It gives life orders. Life does not speak. It listens and waits. Every order word, even a father's to his son, carries a little death sentence, a judgment, as Kafka put it. So the way they're looking at language, it's much the same way they're looking at the unconscious with a capital U, as defined by Oedipus. That it essentially operates by constricting, by essentially killing what it encompasses. And that if we view language as something with a capital L, that there's some absolute language, we in fact have forgot that language is about compelling obedience. And an important part of relating this seemingly benign observation to society in general is that this exemplifies how concepts are inherently political. They say here on page 101, forming grammatically correct sentences is for the normal individual the prerequisite for any submission to social laws. No one is supposed to be ignorant of grammaticality. Those who are belong in special institutions. The unity of language is fundamentally political. There is no mother tongue, only a power takeover by a dominant language that at times advances along a broad front and at times swoops down on diverse centers simultaneously. And the notion that the unity of language is political, that's what they're trying to get at. Not that languages, as such, of different modes of expression, those can be political. But this idea that language is something unified and absolute, that is inherently and irremediably political. It, of course, is laying the groundwork for further forms of submission to other social laws. You're taught how to be grammatically correct in school, and it's enforced. And this is one method among many, which essentially tries to reduce humans to structures. That our methods of existing and functioning in the world are supposed to be pre-social, that they exist already and we have duties to follow before we enter into relations. Instead, Deleuze and Guattari want to say, no. Creativity is what will always be, and it's a question of whether or not we are following that path, which is always circumstantial. An important way in which language can be creative is looking at African American Vernacular English, or AAVE for short. This is the English that's spoken by many middle and working class African Americans across the US and Canada, and also certain parts of the Caribbean maybe, or even Central and South America. I'm really not sure how far we want to go. I mean, there's probably a little bit everywhere. And there's been a long debate in the linguistics community about, is this a variation of English? Is it a dialect or a patois? Is it broken English? Or is it its own language? It's rather arbitrary where we draw this line between one language and the other, because African American Vernacular English represents one of the ways in which one of the most popular languages on the planet is essentially diffused in a state of flux. And AAVE has traditionally been viewed as more barbaric, or a reduction, a more basic form of standard English, that it's somehow more dumb and not as good for communicating complex ideas. And this is entirely unfounded. I mean, some of the greatest pieces of music of the contemporary era are spoken in such a vernacular, and it works perfectly. It's able to communicate ideas about police brutality, or ghettoization, or capitalism and socialism. And AAVE is what Deleuze and Guattari will call a minoritarian phenomena. They basically say, okay, we've got two ways of looking at language. We've got the majoritarian and minoritarian languages. And the majoritarian language, and this is not too dissimilar from a Derridian point, but majoritarian languages are basically defined as this ideal form, like standard English, which is what English, quote unquote, is. Then we've got minoritarian forms, which is the way that language is no longer that way. It's the way in which that language diffuses. And this is naturally going to occur in any system, because if we look at English as an assemblage, for example, it is constituted by various grammatical and phonological rules and alphabetical rules for, its alphabet, from German, French, Latin, Proto-Indo-European, if we want to go with that, various African and Caribbean languages. And as a result of these interacting in different ways, I mean, through the transatlantic slave trade, through interactions with different isolated tribes, we get, for example, Afrikaans, or we get Jamaican Creole, or we get African American Vernacular English, all of which have very particular and very exciting histories of growth and expression. And AAVE is sometimes considered not its own language, or as, at the very least, just a broken form of English, because it breaks certain grammar rules. But in fact, when we look at AAVE, it has consistent grammar and pronunciation rules, and I use rules in quotes because they're not really like formalized rules that have been established through institutions so much as they are tendencies which have been respected by generations in order for people in the slave trade to communicate with each other, for example. People who spoke Ghanaian or Senegalese or, whatever language it may be. Maybe they're from Angola. And these languages come together and they create all of these very interesting differences between it and quote-unquote standard English. Because they're not deviations unless we want to, first off, if we want to use deviation as a negative connotation, I think we could use deviation in a very neutral sense, but it tends to have a negative connotation. But if we look at some of the rules, or the tendencies would be a more accurate term, the tendencies that AAVE follows, we've got some very common pronunciation differences. For example, if I want to say, can I ask you a question? It becomes, can I ask you a question? Ask becomes ax. Brother becomes brother. Or bath becomes bath. And we can see, for example, brother becoming brother. If we pronounce that a little different, brother, it starts to sound like Ugandan. Because, of course, this was a language that was involved in the construction of AAVE. A lot of the modern slang that exists in quote-unquote standard English is technically AAVE, if we want to consider this as our different language. We've got like diss tracks, or if I've got beef with someone, or if I'm going to co-sign, if I'm going to vouch for someone. Also, being verbs or words are often omitted. For example, she over there instead of she is over there. And that's actually quite useful because a lot of philosophers like Deleuze and Guattari don't like being verbs too much because they imply at least some moment of being completely static and unchanging. And this is not true. Deleuze and Guattari want to say that things are always changing, just to varying speeds. And sometimes this is not noticeable because it's practically none, but it's still there. Think of Brownian motion, particles just jiggling at the very minute subatomic level. Even at the atomic level, if you get down small enough, you'll see every particle jiggles just a little bit in a completely random motion. This is that sort of propensity for change. So we can see that actually omitting being words might be something rather nice and rather not passé. Also, you have the habitual be. We be working 24/7. This is like we are always working 24/7. We will continue to be working 24/7. It's how we do it on the regular. You can also do negative inversion, where you can basically put the negative at the beginning of the sentence. Instead of saying, nobody can sing like she can, you can say, can't nobody sing like she can, which is pretty cool and interesting. And it's not technically, quote-unquote, correct according to, quote-unquote, standard English, but it communicates the same idea to millions of people. You can also eliminate the possessive S because oftentimes you can just infer this from context. Instead of saying, I was at my dad's house, you can say, I was at my dad's house. I get what you're saying. You don't need to add the possessive S. And by the way, I'm not trying to be offensive with the accent. I'm just trying to replicate as best I can kind of a quote-unquote standard AAVE, which might be a little bit of a paradox in and of itself. But the important point here is that these transmit concepts, and they do it in an essentially minoritarian way, which serves the function of showing the inherent lack of totalizing capabilities of the major language. That the major language actually has all these lines of flight open, which is to say these kind of channels of change that can be followed, that allow for new forms of English to come about, that can start to create communities which use them. And this can serve some really interesting and subversive and revolutionary functions, such as allowing slaves to communicate with one another by creating their own language. I mean, a very creative process of coming together and recognizing certain words, not recognizing others, compromising on pronunciation as you hear people around you pronouncing. I mean, for example, I use the word y'all a lot more than I did when I lived in the north of the United States, and now that I live in the south, I hear it so much that I use it all the time. So all these variations are in fact what defines the major language, not by being omnipotent, but by being impotent. So for Deleuze and Guattari, it is our job as creative musicians, artists, philosophers, painters, I mean, whatever this may be, to become minoritarian, which is to say, look at all these structures which are considered absolute and have rules like language or morality. I mean, think about social codes. Think about norms of interaction in a business or something like this. And instead of seeing these as pre-existent ideal structures, as representations which pre-exist relations, we in fact see these as post hoc, after the fact, and insist that this is not all that can be. The norm is defined not by what stays, but by what can't help but slip away. As Deleuze and Guattari say, something must ooze from the box. And as such, Deleuze and Guattari want us to take advantage of becoming minoritarian. And there are a number of different minoritarian phenomena which depend on the system. Sometimes violence can be minoritarian. Sometimes it can be majoritarian. Minoritarian violence would be, I don't know, throwing stones at the French police in May 68 to protest Charles de Gaulle. But sometimes violence could be completely majoritarian, like being a member of the Third Reich's army and expand the Third Reich. In that sense, you're using violence in a way in which at one place it is subversive and productive, and at another point where it is complacent and it is reproductive. You are reproducing a code which has already been given to you. And they essentially want us, instead of tracing some pre-made model, they want us to map. They want us to create. And becoming minoritarian entails making language stammer rather than stammering in speech. To be a foreigner but in one's own tongue, not only when speaking a language other than one's own. To be bilingual, multilingual, but in one and the same language, without even a dialect or patois. To be a bastard, a half-breed, but through a purification of race. That is when style becomes a language. That is when all of language becomes a secret, yet has nothing to hide. So essentially, we want to look at language, and we want to look at all the ways in which, how does English proper deviate? Is this idea of English proper even something useful that we should be using when we talk about language? What Deleuze and Guattari want to insist on is that our notions of language are tied up, I mean, like even Chomsky will say, to a number of different defining factors, like their phonology, the different kind of sounds you can make, or grammaticality, the grammatical structure of the language. You've got pronunciation tendencies. You've got what vernacular are you following? What kind of words are you entailing? What's their relationship to other languages? And Deleuze and Guattari want to insist upon apprehending language as a minoritarian phenomena, which is to say, something which maps its own path, doesn't follow some code, but rather gets down to the details and defines language, even everyday language, in a way that makes it subversive. They say, in the course of a single day, an individual repeatedly passes from language to language. He successively speaks as father to son and as a boss. To his lover, he speaks an infantilized language. While sleeping, he is plunged into an oniric discourse, then abruptly returns to a professional language when the telephone rings. It will be objected that these variations are extrinsic, that it is still the same language. But that is to prejudge the question. First, it is not certain that the phonology is the same, nor the syntax, nor the semantics. Second, the whole question is whether this supposedly identical language is defined by invariance, or on the contrary, by the line of continuous variation running through it. So this line of continuous variation, and that's from page 94, by the way, is the inevitable propensity for English proper to splinter. This is a phenomenon in linguistics, linguistic splinter. And if you think about it, the type of English that you speak as a lover versus as a superior in a job setting are completely different. Think about the types of words that you will say to a lover, the sort of foul language that you might use, the innuendos that might be entertained, the inside jokes that only you and your lover would understand, the relaxed tone, think about the pronunciation of, for example, if I'm just talking to my fiance, I might not really articulate my T's very well. I might say titillate instead of titillate. But if I'm in a job setting, say I'm presenting a paper somewhere, something, or I'm reading a memo in an office setting, I might say titillate. I might use this very formal way of addressing people. I might refrain from using language that I might use to a lover. I'll use common phrases that I can reasonably assume that everyone knows. My pronunciation will change. This happens, for example, with AAVE in what is called code switching, where someone who speaks AAVE will shift or switch their code when they're in a formal job setting or in some sort of setting where standard English is better in this given situation for, presenting a certain way. They'll switch to standard English. So they'll switch from an English that in a certain setting might be viewed as broken to a more quote-unquote proper form of English. So all the time, language can be a subversive strategy, provided we try to be multilingual in our own language. We try to make language itself stammer and fall over, and in the process, show our autonomy. So here's our strategic checklist. Neither form nor deviation is in itself more revolutionary. Like we said, violence can sometimes be coded, reproductive, formalizing, like in the case of the soldier in the Third Reich. Sometimes it can be deviation and revolutionary in the case of May 68 or the French Revolution or the Franco-Prussian War or something, And this depends on the context. There is no overarching imperative or rule in all of Deleuze and Guattari's work except to experiment and to create. Those are the only imperatives you'll ever find. In addition, a key underlying theme is that of anti-representationalism. That there is no pre-made structures or representations or forms which pre-exist a social field. And this social field is an assemblage. And things in assemblages, objects in assemblages, these are called partial objects sometimes in Anti-Oedipus, are equiprimordial with the social conditions, the flows, the factors that allow them to function in a certain way and in relation to certain things, to certain factors. So you can't abstract away from reality, or you get an incomplete picture. And thus we have a model for ontology, which is creative without the notion of deviancy. Deleuze and Guattari say on page 239, becoming is a rhizome, not a classificatory or genealogical tree. Becoming is certainly not intimating or identifying with something. Neither is it regressing, progressing. Becoming is a verb with a consistency all on its own. It does not reduce to or lead back to appearing, being, equating, or producing. I hope this lecture has been of some use in understanding some of the concepts in Deleuze and Guattari's work. See any of my lectures I've done a complete series on the entirety of A Thousand Plateaus and parts of Anti-Oedipus. See any of my lectures on postmodernism or German idealism or feminism. Leave constructive or non-constructive criticism in the comments below, and I'll see you in another lecture.